All right, we made it to the final lecture in our fire ecology course. This is chapter 9 in Fire in California's Ecosystems. It's all about fire and animal interaction. So what are the direct impacts that wildfire can have on animals? What are some of the defenses that animals use to protect themselves from wildfire? What are maybe some things that animals do to take advantage of wildfire? And then also the indirect impacts as well. How does the fire impact the habitat? And then how do the animals then respond to that? So we'll be diving into all of that. But we'll be doing it the exact same way we've done all the lectures in the past, where I'll show the 1-minute video, which summarizes the entire chapter, and then we'll break it down section by section and hopefully just learn more about wildfire together. If you're an animal in a wildfire, you have two options: flee or take shelter. It all depends on how fast you are. A tortoise can find protection underground, while deer make a run for it. Trees aren't the best place to be, so birds would fly away if they weren't already busy picking off the prey trying to escape. If you had to pick, you'd probably want to be in the water, although aquatic animals face long-term impacts from wildfire, as increased erosion can reduce water quality. However, streamflow may also bring in woody debris, creating prime real estate for salamanders and fish. On land, fires can enhance habitats by promoting new sprouts and ecosystem diversity. And ecosystem might be the best word to use when talking about wildfire. Fire is interconnected with water, soil, plants, and animals, with feedbacks going in both directions. It's also not always bad news, as fire is an important part of the California environment. Ultimately, there will be fire in California, it's just a matter of what kind. Alright, so we'll break that video down into 3 sections, and this first one will be focusing on the direct effects that wildfire has on animals. And it starts out by saying, if you're an animal in a wildfire, you have 2 options: flee or take shelter. It all depends on how fast you are. A tortoise can find protection underground, while deer make a run for it. Trees aren't the best place to be, so birds would fly away if they weren't already busy picking off the prey trying to escape. So what this section is basically talking about is when a fire comes through, what do the animals do? If you're slow, you're going to take shelter. If you're fast, you're going to try to run away. And what's interesting is research has shown that actually there's a pretty high survivability among animals during wildfires. They can kind of sense it coming, they just know where to go, know where to hide. And the ones that do die are usually scavenged within about 24 hours after the fire. So, that's not good for the animals that died, but it is good for the scavengers, so it kind of just depends on who you're rooting for there. But we can break this section down into 4 little categories. Subterranean, so animals underground. You have surface dwelling, then you have animals in trees, and then you have aquatic. So subterranean, first thing I think about is this cool wildfire documentary I was watching, and it's a pretty dramatic scene with a great English voice narration in the background. And it shows a tortoise, and then he's walking along fairly slowly, and a fire sparks. And all of a sudden, the fire looks like it's getting closer and closer towards the tortoise. And you're thinking, there's no way that the tortoise is going to outrun this fire. But then, what do you know? He goes right into one of his burrows, and then he waits out there. Soil's a very good insulator from heat. It doesn't conduct heat very well. Moist soil can conduct heat better. So maybe a spring fire would be worse than a summer fire for those subterranean species. But overall, it's a pretty good place to be. It's probably the best place to be other than maybe the water. And some of the tortoises will actually create extra exits, which creates a bit more airflow so the smoke doesn't just kind of suffocate them in there. And what was the best part of that documentary is after the fire, it shows the tortoise coming out, but then it also shows all of these animals coming out of all the other bunkers that the tortoise had dug. So the tortoise has his home base, but then he knows that if he's going out looking for food, he might not be able to be fast enough to get to his home base, so he digs all these backup bunkers, and then other animals use those during fires as well. Other animals like maybe snakes or something. And hopefully the squirrels are able to be safe in there as well. So that's subterranean. Then you have your surface dwelling. If you're something slow like a toad, you might just find kind of a moist log to hide under, and a moist log is going to have a lot more moisture in it, so then it's less likely to catch on fire. If you're something fast like a deer or a bear, then you just run for it. And that's where studies have shown that it's pretty rare to find a deer or a bear carcass after a wildfire. So they have a pretty good idea of where they should go to escape. Maybe Smokey is a good mascot for wildfire after all. And then the third one is animals in trees. And the main one that it talks about there are birds. And the reason trees are a bad place to be in a wildfire is, well, you think about the heat from a wildfire is going to rise. So you have convection going up into the leaves. And then the leaves are pretty flammable as well. And then nests themselves are pretty flammable. So bad place to be in a fire. So you would think, oh, the birds are just going to get out of there. But interestingly, birds will actually immigrate to fires because they take advantage of it. And what I think about with this one is a story that the chief meteorologist at KTVU in the Bay Area, Bill Martin, told me, where he went to, I believe it was the Paradise Fire, not exactly sure, but he was at the fire and he sees a front moving along a grassland, and he notices multiple owls like dipping down on the front. And he's a little confused at first, but then he realizes that as the front is moving forward, all of the little animals, things like maybe chipmunks or squirrels or bunnies, you name it, rabbits, I don't know which ones are in the wild, but maybe both of them, or if they're the same thing, I don't know. But they're running from the fire front, so then the owls are just easily picking them off. So bird numbers will actually increase during and after fires. After fires, it's because there's more sprouts coming up, so that brings in more of those little critters. There's also maybe more openings between the vegetation, so less cover, so it's easier to hunt. But that kind of gets into the indirect impacts. The other one that's mostly indirect impacts is the aquatic animals. Like if a fire goes by a stream, it could raise the temperature of the stream slightly, but it's actually more the indirect effects that are going to raise the temperature of the stream. So let's actually just get into the indirect effects now. If you had to pick, you'd probably want to be in the water, although aquatic animals face long-term impacts from wildfire, as increased erosion can reduce water quality. However, streamflow may also bring in woody debris, creating prime real estate for salamanders and fish. On land, fires can enhance habitats by promoting new sprouts and ecosystem diversity. So the indirect effects of wildfire on animals is going to be more so how it impacts the environment or the habitat, and then how that indirectly impacts the animals. And I had previously mentioned, we'll just go into the aquatic one first, how a direct impact would be the fire goes up to a stream and then that raises the water temperature, or I don't know, hurts the fish somehow, but you can imagine why that doesn't happen too often, so it's not that big of a deal. What can actually increase the stream temperature more is if a fire comes through, clears out a bunch of trees, and then there's less shade, and then more sunlight would be able to heat up that stream more, potentially lead to less dissolved oxygen, but it doesn't really seem like that's a big deal either, just because, I mean, if you imagine you're a fish, if there's more sunlight in one area and it's maybe too hot for you, you don't like it anymore, you could just swim like 30 yards downstream and you're probably fine. But there are some important effects that fire can have on the ecosystem that impact aquatic animals, and the main one has to do with increased erosion and then that sediment finding its way into the stream. You've probably seen some videos after wildfires where after the first rain in that area that previously had a fire, the river just looks brown, and you can imagine that's not going to be good for your aquatic animals. But I guess the question would be, why does that happen? And we talked a lot about this a couple weeks ago, but I'll just try to do a quick refresher. So after a wildfire, your soils are going to be more water repellent. The reason for this is, leaves can be kind of water repellent. You see water droplets just staying on them. It's called hydrophobic, which I think means afraid of water. But when those leaves burn up, or some of the oils in those plants burn up, they go into the air, and some of that hydrophobic compound can condense onto the soil particles and almost make that soil water repellent as well. So then when the first rain comes, now it's almost like that leaf where the droplets just stay on the leaf, but now that's your soil. So the rain comes and just rushes right across the soil instead of sinking into the soil. So with more water rushing along, it's going to be rushing faster, there's going to be more of it, so it's going to be able to pick up more sediment, maybe even entire boulders. The other thing, this might be getting too into the weeds, but yeah, we like the weeds here. The other thing that happens is a fire can kill some of those organisms, I believe they're also called like fungi maybe, where what those organisms do is bind the soil particles together. So it makes the soil larger, and they also intertwine the soil together. And if the fire kills them, then they're not intertwining the soil, so it's going to be looser, and it also won't have as many of those soil particles kind of conglomerated together. It's more fine particles, so then it's easier for those fine particles to get picked up by the water. And then on top of that, if you don't have trees holding hillsides in place, then that's easier for the hillside to just get kind of flushed out, turn into a mudslide or something, although mudslides are somewhat rare. What can actually be a larger impact that impacts your water flow is just the fact that there's less trees out there, which is blocking the water getting to the ground. Trees kind of intercept, I believe it's 27% of rain from reaching the ground, so if those trees burn out, more water on the ground. On top of that, if there's less brush and less trees, they're pulling less water out of the ground. So then there's just going to be more water still in the ground, which means it's closer to saturation, which means the next rainstorm wouldn't be able to infiltrate as much. I almost didn't understand that, but it does make sense if you think about it. The basic summary there, though, is you have more water rushing along the ground, and you have finer sediment that's not as intertwined as well, that's also water repellent. So you end up just getting like a river running on the hillside, carrying that sediment into the stream. I wanted that to be a brief summary, but it wasn't, but that's okay. So basically you have all the sediment in the stream. It can harm the fish if it goes into their gills, but maybe what's the larger impact here is it can shade out a lot of the photosynthesis that should be happening with the aquatic plants. And plants are the foundation of the ecosystem, so if the plants die or they just aren't being produced as much, then that impacts the aquatic animals. It's not all bad news. As I mentioned in that short form video, if you get some of the dead trees, or you call them snags, going into the stream, you might think that it would block up the stream, and that'd be bad for animals that are trying to migrate or something like that. But log jams, the textbook was saying, usually don't last a very long time, but what it can do is just provide great little habitats for things like salamanders or fish, maybe a nice little pool for reproduction, and it can actually end up being a benefit. And where we also see some benefits with wildfire is for our surface dwelling animals as well, because it can increase ecosystem diversity. So the way I'll explain this is, if you think about when a fire comes through, let's just say it burns up everything, then you're going to have grass in that area, and then the area that didn't get burned up is going to be maybe still your brush. And grass is usually the first thing to pop up after fire because that just is what grows the most quickly. Your brush might be in an area where a fire happened 3 years ago, and then a fire that maybe happened 10 to 20 years ago, that's where the trees have been able to establish, and then they shade out the brush, and then the trees take over. So if you have this mosaic of different years that fires happened, you're going to have 3 different ecosystems here. And as we know, different animals like different ecosystems. For example, some animals are going to like that grassland, some are going to like the brush, some are going to like the trees. So if you have multiple fires, or even just one fire that has spatial complexity, where it leaves an unburned island, and then one area is high severity burning, and then one area is low severity burning, it can create this mosaic that is basically more different ecosystems, which allows for more different animals. That's probably not grammatically correct, but we'll go with it. Now, the other thing that happens is after a fire, it's going to be just a perfect time for sprouters. And we talked about this last week, but there's plants that have actually adapted to fire, where they'd store up their resources underground, so then the fire happens, and then they sprout right up after that. The other reason it's a great time for sprouters is because a lot of the competition's been cleared out. There's going to be more sunlight, more available water, and some of that burnt material will have kind of brought nutrients back into the soil that could be used by those sprouters. So with all these sprouts coming up, you're going to get all these little animals coming in to eat those sprouts, because animals don't really like to eat an entire tree. They like those sprouts a bit more than a mature tree. So if you get the little animals in there, something like mice, then you're going to get the birds in there. So then you now have prey and predators moving into this area. And then let's say another one, something like deer. And deer actually like when you have that spatial complexity where maybe there's an area that burned, which is now sprouting, but then next to an unburned area. So then they can do a little snacking, and then if they think a predator's coming, they can duck and get some cover. Same with the smaller animals do that as well. But then the deer move in, mountain lions move in, and it can actually just benefit the ecosystem overall. So that leads to more ecosystem diversity. The last one that I'll just mention is it can actually impact migration as well. If you have a fire that just clears out a huge space, then it can actually make it easier for those large animals to migrate through that area, but it can also make it more dangerous for the smaller animals to migrate through that area because now there's less cover for them. So just threw a lot of information at you, but we talked about water, soil, plants, animals, how it all connects together. It's basically all just talking about how wildfire is a part of the ecosystem. So let's now dive into that a little bit deeper. An ecosystem might be the best word to use when talking about wildfire. Fire is interconnected with water, soil, plants, and animals, with feedbacks going in both directions. It's also not always bad news, as fire is an important part of the California environment. Ultimately, there will be fire in California, it's just a matter of what kind. So we already went through this a bit in a previous section, so we probably don't need to dive all the way back into it, but it is just amazing how the whole ecosystem interacts with each other. How you could have a drought, which dries out the soil, which dries out the plants, which then makes it more flammable, so then a fire comes through, which adds more nutrients back into the soil. There's also now less plants pulling up water, so there's more moisture in the soil. Then you get all these sprouts coming up, which then brings in little animals, and maybe those little animals have seeds in their scout, which leads to more plants, which then changes how fire interacts in that environment. And it's all just connected together. It's very complex, is probably the best way to put it. And that's a big part of the reason that I've been creating this fire ecology course, is because wildfires obviously become a problem in California, but in order to really solve it, you have to know a lot about it. And the more I learn about wildfire, the more I realize I don't know. And I think that's just true across basically any discipline. And it's something that we've actually seen in the last few decades and few centuries in wildfire, a constant learning process, but it does look like we're moving in the right direction. But just kind of two examples that kind of emphasize the importance of learning more about wildfire so that our solutions are actually solutions. One of the final things the textbook says is the story of the spotted owl. And it's talking about how for decades we spent probably millions of dollars trying to protect the spotted owl from wildfires because we thought they're creatures that have nests in trees, so if fires come through, it's going to be bad for them and it's going to hurt their population. But more recent studies have shown that while spotted owls do generally like the green habitats, their populations numbers aren't really impacted by fire, and many studies have actually shown that they thrive when fire comes through because it creates more of that biodiversity with the mosaic of habitats that we were talking about earlier that brings in a larger variety of prey, and those sprouts bring in those little things like mice, which the owls would be able to eat. So we had a solution, but we didn't totally understand it, so it actually maybe could have even been counterproductive. And I don't want to act like I'm on some high horse here just talking down on the researchers because, we always just do the best with the information we have. So I'll maybe end with kind of showing my own example of this. So as I was learning about wildfire and realizing what a big problem it is, being a resident of California, it seemed like the problem was, okay, we've done fire suppression for the last 100 years, so all the fuels have built up, the ecosystem is out of whack because somewhere in the Sierra it should be fire every 5 to 10 years, but now it's been 50 to 60, so you have all these fuels building up. And that's the reason that there's such a wildfire problem. So the answer is just prescribe burning. We've just got to put as much fire on the ground, clear out as much fuel as possible, and really reverse this whole process. But then, as I've learned over the last few months of producing this course and few years of just diving into wildfire, it's not true for every ecosystem. While it might be good to put fire on the ground up in the Sierra because that'll clear out some of the fuels, return it to more of the historic fire regime that maybe the giant sequoias evolved in. Again, we're kind of picking favorites there because to promote giant sequoias, you'd then be saying, okay, we don't care about the fur as much, but we won't get into that. But what I'm saying is, up in the Sierra, it might be good to put fire on the ground. But in, let's say, the Southern California chaparral, that could actually wipe out the ecosystem. Because the plants there have evolved to a fire regime that maybe fire would only happen every 50 to 60 years. And those plants need time between fires to store up some savings in the seed bank, store up reserves so that they're able to sprout after fires. And if we just put prescribed fire on the ground every 5 years, it could actually end up destroying the ecosystem that we were trying to help. And that's maybe the biggest thing that I've learned, is that we want to help, but we just need to learn more. So that's what I'm going to continue to do throughout the rest of my career. I'll try to share what I learn with you as well as I possibly can. Hopefully you have watched all the lectures, made it through this course. Amazing if you did. I know not many people have been watching them, but I learn a lot while I produce these. So I'll keep diving in, and one day we'll hopefully solve this whole wildfire problem together. Thanks for watching.